Hi, everyone, and welcome to Mapping the Mind. This panel is going to look at psychedelics beyond the clinic. So I just want to give a little introduction. This year, proceeds from Mapping the Mind are being donated to MAPS Canada and will help fund a study on psychedelic therapy for eating disorders. Eating disorders are among the most challenging mental disorders to treat. Furthermore, mortality rates for anorexia nervosa are among the highest of any psychiatric disorder. Traditional treatments for eating disorders are relatively ineffective, and there is growing evidence that psychedelic-assisted therapy could be effective in treating this population. This phase 2 study, led by Dr. Adele LaFrance, will look at the potential of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat anorexia nervosa and bulimia. And it will have 3 sites, 2 in Canada, Toronto and Vancouver, and 1 in the USA, Denver. Conference attendees are able to donate directly to support this study through Crowdcast by using the donate button at the bottom of the screen. So the discussion will consist of about 30 minutes of a semi-structured discussion and then half an hour of questions. You can submit your questions using the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. So the panelists with us today are Chris Bache, PhD. He is a professor in philosophy and religious studies at Youngstown State University, where he taught for 33 years. I think what you all are going to be most interested is his work on LSD and the mind of the universe, a story of his 20-year journey of LSD. We also have with us John Vervaeke. He is a assistant professor in the teaching stream at the University of Toronto.
I'm an associate. I have tenure now.
Associate. Okay. Well, perfect. He teaches in cognitive science. Sorry, now I lost my place. He also teaches a course in Buddhism, psychology and mental health, and Buddhism and cognitive science. He has published articles on relevance realization, general intelligence, mindfulness, metaphor, and wisdom. His abiding passion is to address the meaning crisis that besets Western culture. And we have Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-H, is an Anglo-Saxon philosopher of mind who specializes in the thought of Whitehead and Nietzsche and in fields pertaining to panpsychism and altered states of sentience. So I'd like to introduce all of our panelists and thank you all for being here. So the psychedelic renaissance has generally focused on the medical and psychotherapeutic applications of psychedelics. But I think that for many people who've taken psychedelics, those are kind of just the beginning of what psychedelics can offer us. So I'd like to ask you all, what do you see as the most important use for psychedelics beyond psychotherapy?
Well, I'll jump in. I think psychedelics represent a pivot point in the history of philosophy. Am I coming through okay? Yeah. Okay. I think it's a true before and after point. It's not simply relevant to psychology and revolutionary for the treatment of clinical conditions, but I think it has enormous implications for cosmology, metaphysics, how we do philosophy, and expanding our understanding of the universe. I think it's absolutely essential and a major turning point. Gentlemen?
Okay, I'll jump in. Well, I can't disagree with that. I'd add my particular interest in psychedelics is in relation to philosophy of mind. So expanding our phenomenology, relating this to the mind-matter mystery, the hard problem of consciousness. What does the experience say to that? Can it sort of refute certain theories like behaviorism, eliminativism? Is intentionality required for consciousness? Is the species present always of the same duration? And then with metaphysics, along with what Chris was saying, I'm quite interested in whether it is in accord with any certain classical metaphysical systems. And I'm especially looking at Spinoza's metaphysics at the moment, but I've looked at Whitehead's before, and also quite interested in the great chemical philosopher Humphrey Davy, who was the pioneer of nitrous oxide research. And his statue is a few miles from here in Penzance. And I think it's very interesting how he and some of his friends like Coleridge and so on took this and became idealists. And Davy wrote a poem on Spinozism and things like this. And this was a sort of 1799. So at the foundation of this sort of pioneering Western experimentation with psychoactive drugs, you get this link with philosophy, which then sort of lost, and then it became clinical, interestingly. So I'd like to explore that a little bit. And that's just, one of many interests I have.
So I share overlapping interests with both Chris and Peter. I have two sets of interests around psychedelic. One is a cognitive scientific interest, and the interest is to, it's similar to what Peter said. I'm interested in how psychedelic states and overlapping mystical states, what they might tell us about the nature of consciousness. I have arguments following Peter, following what Peter said and following Foreman, the idea that many of the things that are taken to be central to consciousness in everyday philosophy of mind are often lacking in higher states of consciousness, and that challenges sort of a monophasic understanding of consciousness within the philosophy of mind. So that's a very big part of it. And then I have, and then there's an interest in what I call the ontonormativity of these higher states of consciousness. Why is it that we're generally dismissive of most altered states of consciousness as bizarre or weird or not real or illusory, but we have these other states of consciousness, sometimes called higher states of consciousness, that often are almost lacking in content. They often can be ineffable. They're unlike anything else anybody experiences in their everyday life, yet they're regarded as somehow more real. So that more realness that Yaden and other people, they're doing it at the McLean Lab and stuff like that. I'm very interested in that ontonormativity. And whether or not that ontonormativity, the more realness, translates into any epistemic authority. Does it license people making knowledge claims on the basis of that? And then in connection with that, I'm interested in psychedelics from a philosophical perspective, but philosophy in the sense of Pierre Hadot, where we're talking about philosophy not as the current academic project of generating metaphysical theory and meta-scientific critique and things like that. That's a valuable project. I'm not dissing it, but I'm interested in what I sometimes call Philia Sophia, the cultivation of wisdom. I'm a wisdom researcher. I do a lot of work on the nature of wisdom. Wisdom is distinct from knowledge per se. And I'm very interested in how psychedelic states, and in particular the mystical states and the higher states that they can trigger, are conducive to the cultivation of wisdom, because that has to do with what was mentioned as my abiding interest. I think I have a video series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and a discussion series called Voices with Vervaeke around the theme that the West is going through sort of a crisis in meaning. And you can see this symptomatic throughout the crisis, throughout the culture in many ways. I won't go over that. That literature is available for people to check out. And I think part of what psychedelics can do, if properly housed and homed, can be ways in which people can cultivate the kind of transformative wisdom that is going to be needed to responding to the meaning crisis. So that's sort of my three areas of interest: the cognitive scientific, an epistemic interest, the ontonormativity. They all are all related. And then the relationship to the cultivation of wisdom.
So I'd like to talk about the epistemic value of psychedelic experiences. Where are the limits on this experiential knowledge? What do they give us knowledge about? Do they just give us knowledge about the functioning of the human brain, the human mind, or can we say that there's something beyond ourselves that they give us valuable and valid access to?
Well, I guess I'll go first because I guess I'll be the most provocative. I'm skeptical about the degree to which the ontonormativity, the sense of the realness of the experience, translates into knowledge claims. I think I'm much more supportive of the idea that the ontonormativity, that sense of enhanced realness, translates into an increase in wisdom, because there's good empirical evidence for the second one, and it's growing empirical evidence. And the reason why I'm skeptical about the first claim, let me be clear. I think, and I think I'm in agreement with Peter about this. I think that these psychedelic experiences do give us knowledge in the sense of something that can become a scientific theory about consciousness, its nature and function. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when people are making claims, metaphysical claims on the basis. And the reason for that is because of a pluralism problem. So I've been, I read a lot of this literature, read a lot of this reports, talk to a lot of people, and the variation in the metaphysical claims that comes out of these experiences is vast. It's huge. I mean, it can be as dichotomous as people coming out of a higher state of consciousness and saying, now I know for sure there's a God, and the next person coming out and say, now I know for sure there's no God. And they're both equally joyous, and they're both talking about how wonderful it was and how super real it was. And so it's very hard to get, I think, around that pluralism problem. If you pay attention not to the propositions that people utter, but the skills and virtues they acquire, then there's a lot more consensus. There's a lot more consensus in the empirical literature about the kinds of transformations you see these people undergoing, and they regularly and there's good evidence to support their claims that their lives get better and they find more meaning in their life. And I think enhancing meaning in life is one of the things that these states reliably do. So I'm skeptical about metaphysical conclusions that come from it. I'm very supportive of the idea that these states give people transformations in other kinds of knowing, procedural knowing how, perspectival knowing what it's like, participatory knowing by being, that are involved in the cultivation of skills, virtues, new identities, and enhanced connections, meaning in life. I'm very confident that those claims can be substantiated. I'm not so confident about the metaphysical claims. Now, one final thing, and then I'll stop talking. I do think that the knowledge, the enhanced phenomenological information we get, and the way it challenges the idea of a monophasic mind and a monolithic mind, I think that will feed back into what Peter rightly called the hard problem of consciousness. And I think solving the hard problem of consciousness is going to require, it is requiring a change in our fundamental ontology. I have a series right now that I'm doing with Greg Enriquez called Untangling the World Not of Consciousness, where we're going through all of those arguments. So I think in an indirect way, it can feed back into the metaphysics. So that's what I have to say about that. I know that there'll be disagreement, but I hope it'll be fruitful disagreement.
Yeah, Chris, if you'd like to respond to that, I think that you could, your cosmology that you've developed could really speak to what he's saying as a contradictory viewpoint. Oh, you're muted.
Can't hear you, Chris. Can't hear you.
See if
maybe I was thinking that probably John is the thesis, Chris is the antithesis, I'll be the synthesis in the middle of this probably. So better if Chris goes first, but if he can't, I can go ahead. I don't want to talk over him, though. Okay, I'll just say something. Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd say is I don't think you can avoid metaphysical claims at all. I mean, I don't think there's sort of a default view of reality. I mean, there's, like even physicalism is metaphysics, obviously. With regard to the epistemic value of psychedelic states, I mean, I don't think you can ever gain certainty, and I'm skeptical of a number of claims, obviously. I think that you can gain knowledge, as I mentioned, negatively, in that sort of apathic way. You can say certain things are perhaps refuted, such as behaviorism, eliminativism, and so on, or illusionism, and necessary conditions for consciousness. I think all of these can be refuted just through pure experience. But I do think there's possibility of certain metaphysical claims, like, for example, And I know that the claims are often widely antithetical, as you say, but there are certain elements, phenomenological elements, that you could say are somewhat perennial, thus you get this term perennial philosophy, but perhaps not to the extent that Huxley pushed it. But for example, our knowledge of time. I think that this is the distortion of time is a very common experience under psychedelics. I recently, for the first time, tried the ultimate psychedelic, which is a 5-MeO DMT, and this had a profound effect on my notion of time. I'd say this: there's no objective species present. There's no objective length of the present. Even within one person's life, that may be elongated or contracted, and with psychedelics you get interesting elongations of that. Now, could you say that's not a knowledge claim? That's not a veridical experience. You could say, well, there's no fact to the matter. I mean, there's just there's no objective species present. And then, of course, if you elongate that, if you accept that and you elongate that ad infinitum, then you'll get this very common again. Well, this is all debatable, but this is almost a cliche. It's so common, this experience of eternity, of timelessness, stepping outside of time. Now, there's two ways to approach that. First of all, you could just say that's not a knowledge claim. I don't know if that's what you're saying, John, but in this case, that's a sort of some kind of dissociative hallucination. Or you could look back at the old metaphysicians. I mean, like I said, I'm looking at Spinoza, but even people like Boethius or Saint Augustine, and see that there are perhaps reasons for believing in eternity, timelessness, in an objective sense, or even Minkowski, Einstein sort of claimed this. And therefore, if a mind-independent reality did not have past, present, future, as we understand it, did not have a species present, then you can sort of say, you could speculate. It's only speculative, but so is everything in my view about reality. You could sort of say that is perhaps a veridical experience. Of course, the experience itself can't prove it to be veridical, although there is that noetic element that William James talks about when you're in it. When you're out it again, you might forget that. You lose it quickly. This is why you should always record an intense psychedelic experience immediately afterwards and try to get that intensity in memories before it's lost. So I am skeptical of many claims made in the psychedelic literature about alien beings, seeing these sort of demonic beings and them having their own subjectivity. I think that's I'm not denying it totally, but I think that would be extremely hard to validate. Not to say it's not true, but it'd be hard to validate, and thus it wouldn't be knowledge really under a traditional conception of knowledge. Those kind of things I'm skeptical about. I am more interested and more sympathetic to the veridicality of certain perennial themes like time and space and so on. But more research is needed. Now, hopefully, Chris can speak.
Do I have a mic on now?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. I represent probably then an extreme position on the panel. So let me give you just a little bit of background on my work. I had just finished graduate school in 1978. I had done my dissertation, published some articles out of it, when I encountered Stan Grof's work, Realms of the Human Unconscious. One reading of that work convinced me that psychedelics were very important would become increasingly important to philosophy. But in order to really incorporate this potential, one had to work out of an experiential basis, not simply a theoretical basis, an inferential basis. So what I did is I divided my life into two strains. I basically have lived my life as a professor of religious studies. I had taught in Eastern religions, Buddhism, transpersonal studies, comparative mysticism, so on and so forth. So I've spent my entire life immersed in the academic study of spirituality, in a sense, and cross-cultural studies. But in my private life, I began a 20-year journey working with high doses of LSD. I followed...
Just when it was getting to the crux.
There seems to be an imp of the perverse thwarting Chris.
Someone's stopping this knowledge getting out.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'm back on again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, can hear you now, Chris.
Good. What I did, I was trained as an analytic philosopher. Before that, I was trained as an historian. So I really have a natural bent towards precision of work. And I chose to work after 3 medium dose sessions. I chose to do 73 high dose psychedelic sessions using Stan's protocol. Totally internalized, the whole 9 yards, earphones and whatnot, very carefully curated playlist, always protected by a sitter. Really important, because I think when we're going to evaluate the epistemic warrant of psychedelic experiences, the methodology that we're using has to be taken into account, because there's so many places where distortions and compromises can enter in. So it's really important to create the conditions for clear contact and clean contact and immediate recall. Like you, Peter, I'd emphasize writing up a complete account, phenomenologically accurate account of every session within 24 hours, which was my protocol. And I developed a protocol within that for getting maximum extraction of memory from it. So what I did was, in a systematic way, I did 73 dose sessions working at 500 to 600 micrograms, keeping meticulous record of my journey. I worked for 4 years. I stopped for 6 years for reasons that I explain in my book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And then I worked for 10 years. The issues that I hear John and Peter raised about the veridicality issues, the epistemic warrant of these experiences, all very important issues. I understand them, and I've tried to address these in my work. In my book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, where I begin to bring out some of my own experiences, and I'm looking at the interplay of the cosmologies, whether of near-death episode research, out-of-body research, and psychedelic research, whether those cosmologies tend to run in different directions or whether there is a natural convergence. I argue that there is a convergence in the cosmological worldview amidst the enormous variety, of course, in each of those contexts. Not all near-death episode people have the same experiences, so on and so forth. But once we're looking at large bodies of data, once we really have a large phenomenological net, I think we can recognize patterns and a convergence of cosmological vision. In my own work, what I experienced is that I went through not just one death rebirth experience at the level of egoic consciousness, what Stan Grof calls the perinatal level of consciousness, but I went through a series of death rebirth experiences at different levels of consciousness. And when I would break into a new level of consciousness, it was cognitively overwhelming. I could not remember completely all of my experiences. I could only get fragmented pieces. But I found that if I went back over and over again with the same test conditions, basically my cognition became clearer. I was able to understand and retain more of my experiences. I had basically learned how to acclimate at that level of consciousness. And then I learned the rules of how that level of consciousness worked. Now, working with high doses of LSD that were this powerful, it kept driving me up against the levels, the boundary of that level of consciousness. And then eventually it catapulted me into yet another level of consciousness. All things said and done, I basically felt like I became cognitively operational at 5 discrete levels of consciousness. One which I would describe as taking place at the personal level, the level of personal unconscious, one at the collective unconscious, one at archetypal levels of consciousness, one at causal oneness. And for the last 5 years, I was working at a level that I call diamond luminosity, what Buddhism would call the clear light of absolute reality. Fortunately, I had enough background in kind of the cosmology emerging out of the world spiritual traditions to use that as a foil within which to understand some of my experiences. I completely agree that there isn't an objective reality that we just read in these experiences. It's a much more complicated, dynamic process. I agree with Jorge Ferrer in a participatory cosmology. It's like we're using mind to explore mind. And the mind, in my experience, is that the universe is an infinite potential. And the mind that we drop into the encounter catalyzes a certain set of experiences out of that potential. But so therefore, there's an interaction between the mind which we are exploring with and the mind which we are exploring. But as we are changed and purified and go through the various purification processes that this work engenders, the mind that we drop into this infinite potential subsequently catalyzes a different and deeper set of experiences out of this infinite potential. And if we are well focused, if we're clear and engaged conscientiously with an emphasis upon clear recall, and we are internalizing our experiences as we go, my experience was that the consciousness of the universe, or the consciousness of, I don't know what you want to call it. You can call it divine if you want. I'm not really happy with that because of the cultural overlays of concepts like God and the divine. So I tend to be more comfortable with speaking about the mind of the cosmos, or the mind of the universe. But my experience is that this consciousness took me in and educated me systematically, rigorously, requiring enormous pain and suffering in order to become operational at successive levels of consciousness. It took me in and showed me things and taught me things, and over again in an organized and systematic fashion. Now, that doesn't mean that I take my experiences as an absolute truth and that everything that happened on my journeys is real as I experienced it to be real, because part of the issue with establishing the epistemic word in these experiences is comparing what we experience to other areas of knowledge once we come back, and comparing our experiences to the experiences of other psychonauts in this. So it's really when we look at our collective experiences that we have the highest chance for getting some type of objective body of knowledge, whether it's in cosmology, whether it's in epistemology, whether it's in brain science, so on and so forth. I guess that's enough for now. I'll shut up and let's go.
So, Chris, you said that psychedelic experience can be ineffable, but that you managed to stabilize it. So,
no,
John,
I don't say it's ineffable. In fact, I critique the concept of ineffability.
Yeah, sorry, that is what I meant to get at.
Yeah.
John, as somebody who's worked with different practices, can you speak to the idea of using some of these other practices to make the ineffable something that we can actually talk about?
Well, it depends what you mean by ineffable. There's many traditions, for example, within Buddhism, Vedanta, Neoplatonism, that argue that the ultimate is ineffable, not in the sense that we can't sort of talk in an ostensive way around it, but that there is no propositional or conceptual representation that captures it in any way that does it justice. So, I mean, I'm not just saying that. That's something that is often said, and there's been some recent work done on the ineffable. I mean, and then there's an aspect of the ineffable that is very part of our mundane experience. Let me go back to something that's always allow me to nuance my reply to Peter. So when I said there's no, I was being a little bit sloppy perhaps. I was trying to indicate I think there's 4 kinds of knowing, and they correspond to different kinds of memory. There's propositional knowing, and you get semantic memory. There's procedural knowing, which gives you procedural memory, and it's actually organized in different areas of the brain. There's perspectival knowing, which gives you episodic memory, and then you have participatory knowing, which gives you the memory that we call our sense of self. And when I said I don't think there are strong knowledge claims, I just meant it in the first sense of propositional knowing. I think people pick up tremendous kinds of knowing how to pay attention, knowing how to reflect, knowing how to distance. I think they get a tremendous perspectival knowing. They know what it's like to see things from a less egocentric perspective. And they obviously get a transformation in the sense of self. Some people say they discovered their true self. Some people say they discovered that there is no self. Again, there's lots of variation on that. So I want to be clear about. I don't want to be pinned as the guy who said there's no knowledge, right? I said that's why I tried to pin it as there's no theoretical knowledge. That was my more specific claim. I tend to think that, and the reason why I'm concerned about this is I think there has been an overemphasis on trying to establish, let's call it the propositional veridicality of these states to the exclusion of the procedural, perspectival, and participatory knowing. I do 4E Cog Sci, right? And this is the idea that most of our knowing, most of the thing that makes us a cognitive agent isn't our belief states. It's knowing how, right? It's knowing what it's like. It's knowing by being, the whole embodied, embedded idea of our cognition. And I think the overemphasis on the propositional has caused us to neglect these other three. And why I consider that really important is because there's increasing evidence that the sense of meaning in life, not the meaning of life, which is some cosmic destiny, but what I mean by the meaning in life, the degree to which people rate their lives as meaningful. So even when they are unhappy or discontent, they think life is worth living. That's what I mean by meaning in life. And many people are suffering dramatically from a loss of meaning in life right now. Like that's why suicide rates are up, depression is up, anxiety is up. People are doing the virtual exodus into the virtual world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think just one more point.
Yeah.
If we turn to the way these experiences transform those kinds of knowing, that's what I meant by wisdom. But they give us a way of deeply cultivating the transformations that enhance meaning in life. I think that is much more valuable. And I'm taking by analogy the millennial age project of trying to somehow negotiate between religious pluralism and claim, and that has not come to any convergence or consilience. I think I'm worried that we're going to get into the same kind of project with the metaphysics that come out psychedelic research, and to the extent that we're ignoring these facets that we have good empirical evidence that make a direct contribution to enhancing meaning in life and directly reducing suffering. These states have a lot of overlap with the flow experience, and the flow experience reliably improves meaning in life. It's a prophylactic. It's a prophylactic to depression. It's a reduction in anxiety. It helps people overcome self-deceptive and destructive patterns. And I'm not talking about therapy. I'm talking about experiences broadly.
I mean, I was gonna. When you talked about the different types of knowledge, of course, what came to my mind is Russell's, distinction between propositional knowledge, as you say, and then practical knowledge. Practical knowledge, and then knowledge by acquaintance as well. And then it's also, I found it. Have you read this book by Russell, The Mysticism and Logic, or is it Logic and Mysticism? But anyway, it's
a long time ago in undergrad.
It brings it to mind because Russell had a mystical experience which changed his meaningfulness, as it were, in life, not in a logical positive sense, but he was suicidal, and then he had this mystical experience with the Whiteheads, Whitehead's wife, and she was in intense pain. And suddenly, in his autobiography, Russell's autobiography says the sort of earth opened up, and I came into this timeless state, and immediately afterwards, it only lasted 5 minutes in Earth years, he was pacifist, and before that he was an imperialist. Just one experience like that. Another interesting thing related to Russell is A.J. Ayer, who had a mystical experience, wasn't drug induced, well, not from the outside, but he had this near-death experience, which reads like a psychedelic experience. And after it, he said, A.J. Ayer, Alfred Jules Ayer, was the sort of Richard Dawkins of the 70s, blah, blah. And then, but after this, and he wrote about it in Sunday Telegraph in 1988, I believe, he said, I'm not sure that the death is the end of us after all. I still don't believe in God. That's complete rubbish. But, the afterlife, maybe. And he got into a lot of trouble for it. But with Russell, then, in this book on mysticism, logic, he talks about, it's quite interesting, he talks about the fact that a lot of mystics, and if we, for the moment, conflate mysticism and certain psychedelic states, they're not always the same, but there is a point of contact. They often lead to amoralism. like going beyond good and evil, because you suddenly see you're de-inculcated, as it were, deculcated, if that's the word. You're taken out of your society and you see their mores and values more objectively. And that's sort of, this is the hermit's life, the mystic's life. You live outside of society. And I have no Octavio Paz, the Nobel laureate. He wrote about this in relation to psychedelics as well. He was a bit of a Nietzschean, but he did. And this was quite a prevalent theme in literature about mysticism in the sort of early 20th century even. But then it's interestingly in the post 60s, when we talk about psychedelics, we talk about them giving meaning. And certainly in my life, after my first experience with psilocybin, I suddenly gained a massive renewed respect for nature, natural objects. And I think they are very conducive to an ecological reevaluation, which is much needed now, of course. But then you see, so my question really is a really interesting contrast there. So in one sense, psychedelics and mystical experience generally can take you beyond good and evil in a theoretical amoralism. In another way, it can make you more value laden, as it were. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that in terms of the values that psychedelic experience can deliver to the taker, if one can generalize.
I'm a little bit hesitant because I'm worried that we're excluding Chris from conversation. So I do want to answer your question, Peter, but also I want to make space for Chris to jump in if he wishes to. I can't hear you again, Chris.
Can't hear you, Chris.
Doing now.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay. I'll jump in with something short and bounce it to you, John.
Okay.
I think that one of the recurring experiences in deep psychedelic experience is the experience of oneness. And there are many permutations of that. We dissolve into oneness at many depths. And one of the things I've learned in my work is that there really are many variations of oneness and many degrees of depth of oneness. But when oneness begins to open up powerfully and we begin to experience the profound interconnection and wholeness of the universe, there is an ethic that emerges from that, of course. And out of the experience of oneness, it doesn't make us more violent. It makes us gentler. It makes us more compassionate. But also, part of that experience to getting into oneness often involves a radical expansion of other epistemic categories in which one learns that all of our social conventions are profoundly relative. Historically, they're profoundly relative. I mean, I'm basically a professor of religious studies, and I understand all the religions of the world as being varying attempts of approximation of something that has escaped all of them to different degrees. So on the one hand, there is a relativizing function as we get into deeper and deeper experiences of the creative intelligence of the universe. And at the same time, there is a profound compassion that opens as oneness matures in our experience. So both value added and at the same time value transcending.
I think that's helpful. I'd like to, if I can, respond to both of you. So first of all, Peter, part of it, we want to check whether or not the sort of, well, they weren't completely a priori, but what you know what I mean, these a priori reflections, the way, how predictive they are. And so I think Chris is saying something that is sort of a pattern across the literature, that people start to make this distinction between conventional goodness and, the Plotinus is the goodness beyond being, right? The good that is beyond being kind of thing. And I don't know, Chris, if it automatically creates compassion. The experience of oneness is profound. I've experienced it multiple times myself. And I do want to come back, Peter, so don't let me forget. I think there was something really important in what you said about eternity, timelessness, and how that might ramify back into the metaphysics. I want to acknowledge, I think there's a good point there that bears discussion, but I'm just trying to, so acknowledging that right now. I do think that there's a sense in which there is an enhancement of meaning in life that can cause people to see their particular moral codes as conventional. But what I would say to that is almost typically bound up with a sense that their normal sense of self and agency has also dissolved. So that I wouldn't say that it, now I might have misheard you. Was it amoralism or immoralism that you said?
Amoral.
Right. So I think it's amoral in that sense, precisely because not only does the code fall away, but the kind of entity that the code would apply to falls away. And then you're in this place. And then the idea is that you nevertheless experience a kind of goodness in being, just being itself. Don't push this too hard, but it's much more like an aesthetic goodness than it's like an ethical goodness. And so
this is getting into metaphysics. I'm surprised.
Well, it is, and it is, and that's why I said I wanted to acknowledge there's a sense in which, right, what you said about these experiences can open up our, if you'll allow me, sort of a, I know Davidson problematized this, but you're right, they open up your conceptual scheme so that you start to think of reality extending beyond things that are just actual entities, right? That things that are outside in time and space. But again, what I would say is, typically the warrant for those, it has not come just from the experiences themselves. What you find is, you quoted Spinoza, I've quoted Plotinus to you, you find independent argument, about the nature of intelligibility that posits the necessity of presupposing these kinds of, and so I think it's actually the convergence between the experience and the arguments that affords the epistemic warrant. See, I'm trying to be very clear. I'm not saying that they're valueless. I don't think they carry the warrant on their own. I think they carry it when there's convergence from independent argumentation.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. I mean, it makes me think of Patrick Lundborg, the Swedish psychedelicist who died a few years ago. He wrote a great book called Psychedelia, but he said the problem that philosophers have had in the past with psychedelics is that they've taken a system, Spinozism, Neoplatonism, whatever it may be, and then they've had the experience. They said, that perfectly fits with what I already believe, right? Or, you see in Christianity as well, of course, and so on. But he proposes that rather let the experience itself provide a framework for you. So, the ideal entry point is, if it's possible, and I'm skeptical about this, if it's possible to do away with all your beliefs in some kind of ultra Cartesian manner, then enter it. And this is a bit what you were saying in a way, Chris. It seems that, you sort of had these intense layers of experiences, and those themselves delivered those results, those conclusions you had. I mean, my question would still be, even if that were possible, when one returns to prosaic consciousness, if such is a thing, how do you, if you were inclined to do so, how would you persuade other people that what you noetically took to be the case were the case? I mean, is there an element of persuasion, or is it you only know if you've been there?
I want to add to that before Chris answers, because I think the two questions will be related. On the other side, how do you know when you're wrong? How do you know when you're wrong? Mm-hmm. Because I can tell you have humility. You're not claiming infallibility, you just said it. So you clearly are a fallibilist about this, which means you have some determinate way of knowing when you're wrong. And so how does that work? And then if you could answer, Chris, if you can answer Peter's question, my question together, because I think they bear on each other in an important way.
Well, I began this work as an atheistically inclined agnostic. I had basically done a dissertation on the logic of religious language. It concluded that any attempt to describe the infinite using finite language was like pointing a flashlight at the sky. It's just our language can't bridge it. But then came LSD, and I've spent much of my life since then trying to describe the so-called ineffable. And I think ineffability is simply a sign that you just got lost. If you can't describe where you've been, you just got lost. And that's not bad. We do get lost at the edges of new experiences, but with repetition. And again, you literally, my experience is you have to discipline yourself. You have to be very, very systematic in your protocol in order to learn to sustain clear cognition in these radical states of consciousness. And every time you go deeper, you have to reestablish, you have to go through a deepening of the process that allows you to hold on to clear cognition. As a philosopher, I'm interested not in persuading other people of these things that I've seen, but I am interested in engaging conversation with other people who are actually engaging in this territory, in this exploration. To me, these, and of course, every psychedelic has different qualities. I mean, psilocybin is different than LSD, ayahuasca is different than 5-MeO-DMT, which is different than DMT. So we have to take into account, one, the nature of the substance that we're using. We have to look at very carefully the protocol of the day and the rigor that we're using in approaching the method. I mean, all of these things, the more rigorous we are, the more standardized our protocol, the more we take these factors into account, the more we can kind of narrow the phenomenological field. I think for me, I started working with Stan Grof's categories of psychic, subtle, and causal and non-dual levels of reality. And I understood the framework that he had of these from Ken Wilber's work. I've fleshed them out in my own way in my work. I go beyond them in some ways. But it was a framework that allowed me to sort of anchor these different experiences just to give them certain categories, certain frameworks. I think that if we standardize the protocol and we standardize the substance, we can take different people with different backgrounds, with widely varying philosophical or theological convictions. If we standardize the point of entry and we put the people through this rigorous protocol and bring them back and record, and we keep this up systematically, say 100 people, highly educated people, diverse backgrounds, diverse trainings, put them in for 1 weekend a month, and collect all of that data at the end of that period, then we got a really, really interesting database to look at. I think we're going to see that among all the variability, there is an emerging consensus. Now, Stan says, when you're working with psychedelics, when you're working at the psychodynamic level, because we all have different histories, the experiences vary enormously. But when you come to the boundaries of individual egoic reality, when you come to the boundaries of time-space experience and enter what he calls the perinatal level of consciousness or the death-rebirth level, he says there's a tremendous narrowing of experiences in that we begin to confront the universal human problems, the fundamental, deepest dilemmas. Is there meaning to life? What is any survival of death? Where did I come from? Where am I going? Is it all just a random chance mutation being driven by randomness in the evolutionary process? There's a tremendous narrowing. When we go through that experience, we drop into a level of reality which convinces everybody who goes there that there is something beyond time-space reality. But that's just now the beginning. Now begins the next level of the journey, is the systematic exploration of this beyond time and space reality. And let me mention just one variation, because time has came up, and people talk about eternity, timelessness, and we talk about time inside time and space. But many of my experiences involved modalities of time which were neither time. I mean, I know what timelessness is about. I've experienced true timelessness in my sessions. But there is a phenomenon that I call deep time, which is experiencing a different span of time as simultaneously present, experiencing a larger span of time coherently, cognitively coherently. But clearly, it is still a sense of bounded time, but a different space of bounded time. It's a different span of bounded time. My experience leads me to conclude that there are actually multiple levels of the universe that operate within different contexts of temporal consciousness, and that we can tap into these levels. When you tap into the consciousness that is but appears to be the creative consciousness of the universe, one learns, I think, that this consciousness is aware in a way which is radically extended beyond linear time and linear space. When you linear time is part of time space. When you go beyond the boundary of space, you begin to go beyond the boundary of time. And you just don't drop off of time into timelessness. You drop off the boundary of linear time into different permutations of time. Now, this is my proposal. My conjecture would be that if we took enough people into this territory, we could begin to explore that proposal with some sense of objectivity. And the objectivity is whether people's experiences support this conjecture or whether they don't support it. Ultimately, it's all going to be consensus.
I've done something very similar to that in my lab. What we did is we took some highly standardized and operationalized ways of measuring. They've been validated, people's mystical experiences. We made sure that people were educated in what we were looking for. And we got close to 900 responses on this. And what we found, we didn't find the kind of consensus in the metaphysics. What we found is what I've been mentioning. We found a consensus in a measurable, like we could measure it, quantify it, that what actually was the consensus point wasn't the what, but the how. It was that the experiences shared a lot of the same cognitive machinery as insight or the flow experience. And that was what was actually predictive of any of the more objectively measurable changes in their life. And that is, again, I'm not just speaking of a review of the literature. We've run this experiment. And so it's much more like the skills that people acquire, right? And the process of insight and the process of transformation that seems to be universal. And that seems to do almost all the heavy lifting in predicting the changes in their sense of self, the sense of what matters in their life, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know, that's not exactly what you're saying, but it's along the same lines. We took, measures and scales that have been operationalized, validated. We did this, we carefully did the statistics, and that's what came out of it. It's not really the what, it's the how. It's like the difference between knowing that a cat is a mammal, that's a proposition, and knowing how to catch a baseball. Those aren't the same kind of things. They're not even stored the same way in your brain. You can lose the first and not lose the second, and vice versa. And it's much more that acquisition of skill that is really transformative of people's lives. And that seems to be what I mean, that's only one experiment, but I'm pointing out that I've done something similar to what you're saying in a highly rigorous manner, and it seemed to point much more to not being the propositions, but the skills that people have, new ways of directing attention, new ways of reformulating what they find salient and relevant, that was actually most predictive of a consensus within what was happening and predictive of a consensus in the kinds of transformations we saw in people. So that's what I can report about that.
I would can I just chip in here? I think, though, propositional knowledge can add a lot of meaning to people's lives. Of course, if you believe that something is true, it's going to change your valuation of things, of course, isn't it? So, for example, if you have, I've known many people who have had psychedelic experiences and suddenly see the world in a completely new light, a reevaluation of things, and of course, that is then you can turn that acquisitional knowledge into propositional knowledge. And say, for example, a leaf is not just a leaf; it has an immense internal intrinsic beauty and process, and so on, right? And also, I think a lot of people who are not, haven't studied psychology or philosophy or theology or whatever, they say, you just assume a certain reality, and for those kind of people, a psychedelic will snap them out of that very quickly. And it will suddenly make people realize that, okay, things aren't straightforward as I initially realized.
Totally.
Can I take these original default propositions I had about reality, can I take them as true now? Does this psychedelic experience sort of throw that up in the air? I think there's also, this in the Western legacy, post Descartes, really, of this kind of physicalism, I think it's not good for people's mental state generally. And I think psychedelic can at least make you question physicalism. But having said all that, I still, even if you were to test people, as you say, Chris, and you all come to very similar conclusions, and like I said, I think there are certain things that are similar, but even then, does that really settle the matter? It doesn't really, because of course, everyone could have the same sort of hallucination. If you're, extreme skeptic, I'm not, but if you were, you could say, well, everyone is going to have the same kind of hallucinations because it's coming from the same kind of human brain, right? So that doesn't really prove it. Not that you want to prove it, but in order to persuade others, going back to John's question, I think you still need to say, how could I be wrong? How could I test this in any way? Of course, it's not a scientific proposition that is open to falsification, such metaphysical things. However, I'm skeptical of that because I think there are many other explanations. And I say this as a non-physicalist as well, but you have to have some level of humility about these experiences, even if you've done, 63 high-dose LSD sessions.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you really be sure? But actually, you've spoken about this. One thing I want to come back to, you said you don't believe in ineffability. And this is related to propositional knowledge, of course, that you can't put these experiences into propositions. And for those who don't know what that means, this table is wooden. That's a propositional knowledge. I know my mother, that's not propositional knowledge, but it is actually, but it's also knowledge by acquaintance and so on. But do you really not believe in ineffability? I mean, this is William James's one of 4 chief criteria of the mystical state, that there are certain experiences that just words are not capable of expressing in any way. I mean, when I think about some of my experiences, I struggle to express them. William James, though, of course, he wrote about ineffability, that these experiences are ineffable, and then he continues in the book, varieties of religious experience, 200 pages to describe them. So, there's a certain limit there. But in what sense do you mean that these experiences are not ineffable? Because I think most people would say that, they are.
Let me double back to ineffability, but first let me address your issue about verification and falsification. This is really important. Once you begin to push beyond sensory reality or conventional reality, and you're entering these alternative or expanded states of consciousness, then trustability of these states becomes a real issue. In 2000, I published Dark Night, Early Dawn. This was just after I had finished my 20-year work. And in the first chapter, I spend a considerable amount of time exploring the question of the epistemic warrant of psychedelic experiences. How do we know? How can we evaluate them? What are the criteria that we'll be using? And so there's a discussion there in that chapter on the epistemic warrant of psychedelic experience, which I think is the first time that anyone with a philosophical background has been exploring and addressing these questions. One of the things we want to look at is when people have come back out of these states with veridical knowledge about events or things which we can reasonably eliminate the possibility that they had acquired naturally before they went into these states. If we can find such instances, that's a really important point. And in the footnotes in this chapter, I draw upon Stan Grof's research, where he has cataloged numerous situations and numerous truth claims where people have acquired this knowledge in these non-ordinary states, which they had no way of knowing beforehand. One example, in the case that Stan was supervising, this person had the experience of encountering a human being, spiritual form of a human being in the room, and was rather upset at that, and came out, went back in. Stan go back into it, and in this state, this human being gave him the spirit presence gave a phone number and said, "Please call this number and tell my parents that I'm okay." So with great hesitation, after the session was over, Stan took the phone number, dialed it up, and very carefully approached it. And he identified this voice, identified by himself by name. I think his name was Michael. "Tell them I'm okay." He calls this phone number, ends up talking to the parents, tells them the story, and the parents tell him, Michael was our son. He was recently killed in an automobile accident. And that's a stunning kind of example. We have other examples of things like this. And so these are all covered in the footnote in that chapter. I continue to discuss the issue of verifiability in Diamonds from Heaven. And Ken Ring, Near-Death Episode Research, and I had a discussion around this. We published it in Medium. And it's I think the essay is, Are Deep Psychedelic Experiences Trustable? Where he's pushing me on the trustability, the verifiability or veridicality of these experiences, and I'm responding. So there's some thoughts gathered there. On ineffability, what I mean is this. This idea that mystical experiences are ineffable kind of goes back to
Humphrey Davy even wrote about the ineffability.
Well, I'm going back to Divine Comedy. It's where we really kind of have this early idea with Dante, where we have the idea that when you come back from the celestial realms, you can't bring back the knowledge that you had in those realms. And it's been taken over and standardized in the mystical inventory questionnaire. My experiences, enlightened masters have a great deal of difficulty talking about enlightenment to unenlightened beings. But they have no difficulty talking about enlightenment to other enlightened beings. The question is there a common experiential ground that allows the words to have semantic reference? My experience is I have spent years and years and years really trying to articulate as clearly and precisely as I can experiences which at the time lay at the very edges of my understanding and beyond my understanding. So I would go into these states, I'd try to describe what I experienced. Some of it was really clear. Some of it was, loose at the edges. I'd go back again, and go back again. And my experience has been what is ineffable in the beginning, or what you cannot describe clearly in the beginning. With repetition, you learn the larger context, your consciousness stabilizes in these domains, and you are able to put words to. You are able to give them semantic markers. Now,
but, I mean, you're still limited to the language.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, you're still limited to the language in which you're speaking, though. The word, the sort of vocabulary that you have at your disposal.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, and you do get to places eventually where
we're talking at cross purposes here. Ineffability doesn't mean you can't talk about it. That's not what ineffability means. Ineffability means that you think that you can't talk about sort of essential. You can't capture it in an essential fashion. You can, of course, talk about it metaphorically and all kinds of things. But let's take something that's not controversial. There's aspects of my experience that are ineffable. I can't tell you what dukkha fruit tastes like. I can just tell you it tastes like dukkha fruit. That's it. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't had dukkha fruit, there's nothing I can do. I can point and say it's kind of like a strawberry and it's kind of like this, but until you've tasted it, you don't know, right? But once you've tasted it, you don't then have words that we share. We just go, oh, that.
Yeah.
I worry that
it applies to say any, sex, love. Very hard to put those experiences into words. But when we apply the term,
could you put how to catch a baseball into words?
Hard for me, yeah. But I'm sure some people could.
They can't. You really can't, because you're presuming that the language by which we communicate with each other has the set of representations that will map onto the variables that you're using in your brain to catch a baseball. Why believe? That's not a good reason to believe that.
I would suggest then that to the extent that we want to say that so much of human experience is ineffable, we shouldn't make ineffability one of the marks, the primary four marks of mystical experience, and say this is what is a true mark of when an experience is mystical, if what you're saying is true.
Well, no, I think what we should do is say what the ineffability of mystical experience points to is a continuity with these other kinds of knowing in which ineffability is a huge feature of them, like perspectival knowing and procedural knowing. That's what I think should be done. And I'm also concerned about the thing you said about, the verification. But I mean, I'm sorry, but the research on these kinds of claims about getting these kinds of knowledge, it's just not got a good history. I mean, there's base rate fallacy all over the place. People don't record, right? They don't tend to record all the times when people do these bizarre things and they turn out to be false. They only note the ones that tend to be true. And people do this even in an everyday experience. I was thinking of Agnes. I hadn't thought of her in months. And as soon as I thought of her, within 5 minutes, she called. And you go, oh, no. But the thing is, what they don't do is notice all the people they think of in the day who don't call them, right? I thought of Benito Mussolini. He didn't call. I thought of Paul McCartney. He didn't call, right? Reconstructive memory is highly inaccurate. 49% of confident eyewitness testimony turns out to be false. Memory is not an accurate recorder of the past. It is an intelligent predictor of the future. Your memory is always altering in order to make you more adaptively prepared for the future. I study memory. I don't trust it. And I certainly don't trust it when people have things that they remember as being unusual or unique, precisely because of base rate fallacy. I mean, that's what happens repeatedly in all of the ESP research and the parapsychological research. It always suffers from replication, because when you control for base rate and when you control for implicit learning, the phenomena go away. So I need to know what's different in your circumstance from these other things that makes it trustworthy for me, because just the extraordinariness of it is insufficient as an epistemic marker, because analogous versions of extraordinariness turn out to be highly defective. They turn out to be highly defective.
I hear what you're saying, and I understand the arguments. I live in a department filled with philosophers, so I understand the positions. And at the same time, when researchers are being careful, when they are being scrupulous, attentive to the phenomenology of the circumstances, I think we've seen this in near-death episode research. People come out of near-death experiences having insights and knowledge about things that's very, very hard to understand in any other terms. People who find out, for example, in their near-death experience that they were in fact adopted, that they have a brother that they've never ever known.
How do you explain the disconfirmation? They've run a whole bunch of experiments where they've have things that can only be seen from above in all kinds of hospital rooms and all kinds of things. And when people, and all you have to do is say, what was in one of those boxes when you were seeing your body from above? Hundreds of cases, and nobody's been able to report anything, ever. What do you do with that disconfirmation?
I would put it alongside areas where we do have striking confirmations and as a puzzle. I don't think we can dismiss all of these things in this broad generalizations. When people come out of a surgical procedure and
No, I wasn't saying one or the other. I was saying you should then be agnostic. If you have a lot of confirmation and disconfirmation, it means you don't have a proper theoretical construct. You should be agnostic about knowledge claims on the basis of it, right? Isn't that the proper epistemic response? I'm not saying you're wrong.
I think we need to be discriminating and very careful. But I'm not convinced that all of the epistemic claims simply dissolve under.
Well, what would convince you? What would convince you?
What convinces me that some of these epistemic claims are legitimate.
No, I'm asking the opposite. What would convince you that they turn out to be wrong? Because
what would convince you that some would turn out to be true?
Well, if that experiment that was set up provided that evidence, I would say, wow, that's really good confirmation. That's great. That's great evidence that when people are floating above the body, they are really above the body. They're not hallucinating it or anything like that, because they got visual information about what was in these trays. That would convince me. And I think it would convince many people. I don't think that's ridiculous to say. Many people would go, oh, crap, that's convincing.
Yeah. But I think of someone like Michael Sabin, who was a cardiologist and was really upset. This is a long bit ago, very upset with all the near-death episode accounts that were beginning to come out and be generated. And he decided to do a really critical study of people who had from surgical procedures. And he was absolutely convinced that under a sufficiently critical methodology, that these accounts of people seeing things while they were under the influence of anesthetic, when they were out of their body and so on and so forth, that they would evaporate, that they would dissolve in the manner in which you're speaking. What he found was that his study of his cases led him to write a book in which he basically became converted to the premise that actually people were having veridical experiences in many of their out-of-body states, that they were accurately reporting what was going around and happening in the surgical theater. They were accurately reporting details about what was taking place down the hallway in the visitor's room while people were waiting for them to get through their surgery. That just these things didn't dissolve and go away. Now, it's not that I'm saying we should be all believing and non-discriminating in the assessment. We need to be scrupulously careful in examining the data. But I've been watching people who have been examining the data, and they've been finding some positive results.
But I find exactly the opposite. I've just read some recent meta reviews of all of this that came to a very negative conclusion about these out-of-body. And I've also seen all the work of people like Metzinger and others who are able now in the lab to generate out-of-body experiences reliably with people. And it's by basically creating a sophisticated kind of perceptual illusion.
Yeah.
So there's an alternative explanation of the experience. The meta reviews that I've seen have largely concluded negative about these out-of-body experiences.
Yeah, I understand. I don't accept.
Okay.
Well, we're moving away from psychedelics here.
Yeah.
Is there a Q&A session, did you say?
So before we go to audience questions, I'd like to pivot from where we're talking, and so let's envision a future psychedelic academy that was going to incorporate experiential sessions with psychedelics into its pedagogy and research practice. Especially considering some of these issues you raised, John and Chris, what do you think a graduate level psychonaut training program in psychedelic exploration should entail, so that people don't end up caught up in these issues, so that they can really, truly get an authentic understanding of what's happening?
Peter, you want to jump in?
Well, I'll just say that interesting. There was this proposal once by Huxley, John Smithies, and Humphrey Osmond. Coined the term psychedelic. It's called the Outsight Project. It's sort of what you're saying here. In the 1950s, and they were going to get as you said, Chris, as suggested rather, 100 leading minds of the age. That included Einstein, Jung, H.H. Price, Ducasse, A.J. Ayer, right? And they were all going to give them mescaline in controlled environments to see, what the conclusions would be. And it was almost happened. They were going to get funding from the Ford Foundation. In the end, it didn't happen. It was a great disaster because 10 years later, then Timothy Leary came along and it sort of got out of hand in America, in the world.
Yeah.
How I would foresee it? Well, in Exeter University, where I'm based, we are actually setting up a psychedelic center. And we're sort of focusing on the social sciences, which includes next to philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and so on. And, you'd never get permission at the moment to actually give any compounds to students, even though they're taking modafinil or whatever all the time. But I think there's a need for it. On a greater level, if we look back at ancient Greece and you look at the Eleusinian mysteries, this was something that everyone attended who could speak Greek and wasn't a murderer, including Plato and Aristotle, no doubt. There's even speculation that some of Plato's reports of mystical experiences come from these Eleusinian mysteries, which was Eleusis was 13 miles from Athens, and this provided sort of one of the main functions of this was this annual, biannual, but there's one main annual event, was to alleviate the fear of death in the populace. And now there's a question as to whether happened here was whether in this potion they took, the kykeon, whether it was a psychedelic compound or not. But nonetheless, the effect seems to be somewhat similar. And it seems to be a great balm to Athenian, Greek society at the time. We're talking 2,000 years ago here, closed down by the Romans, the Christianized Romans in the 4th century, 5th century. But I think that, if you got it right, it would be a great tonic to society, because I think ultimately what's happened with our society is And, it's coming from Nietzsche a little bit, but, since we've, in our post-Christian world, at least here in England, maybe not America, in our post-Christian world, people have no meaning left in their life. Well, they have little, they have sort of comforts and satisfactions, but there's no ultimate metaphysical framework in which they can set themselves. And I think psychedelic, Schopenhauer spoke about this. He was an atheist, but he spoke about this metaphysical need that all people have. And I think that psychedelics are becoming popular once again, because they do provide that metaphysical need. Now, not obviously, as we've seen here today, not everyone agrees on what that means, but nonetheless, they start the questioning. They're not just therapeutics, they're not just clinical. I mean, this is like really the lowest form of psychedelics. I mean, this is negative. Yes, you can cure the sick. This is fantastic, but it's like I always say, it's like music. The sort of music has an intrinsic value. It also makes people feel better, whatever. This is instrumental afterwards. But you can't say the value of music lies within its healing potential. And I think the same for psychedelics. There's much more than medicine there. It can sort of, I think it has a real potential to enhance a whole society, really, ultimately. Speaking in general terms.
I agree with Peter. I think very much that we're going through a meaning crisis, and that's why I do a lot of work studying the way these experiences transform meaning in life. And I think there's very good reason to believe that psychedelic compounds give people experiences that do enhance meaning in life. I think they're on a continuum with other kinds of experiences people have, mystical experiences, flow experience, what are called transformative experiences. And I think we should study the whole family because they all have the power. Often to very significant degrees. What this meaning in life is like, I think it has a lot to do, like I said, with enhancing a sense of connectedness to oneself, to other people, to the world. Maybe that's the metaphysics Peter is talking about. What seems to contribute most to meaning in life is what's called mattering, the sense that you're somehow connected to something that's larger than you, in the sense that has a value that transcends your egocentric interest. So maybe that's where Peter and I could agree it's a more metaphysical thing, perhaps. And I think that's all important. And I think responding to the meaning crisis is something that's urgent and exigent. I think when people are experiencing meaning scarcity, like what scarcity mentality research shows, is they become very rigid, they become very resistant to change, they try to preserve. But when people have a sense of tremendous increase in meaning in life, they will make huge sacrifices. I give you a very mundane proof of that. Having a child. If you ask people when they're having a child, what happens to their subjective well-being? It goes down, their health goes down, their finances go down, their relationship goes down, their work goes down. It's like, well, why are you doing this crazy thing? Well, meaning in life goes up. Meaning in life goes up. So people will sustain huge changes, reliably will sustain huge changes to their standard of living if they believe they're going to have enhanced meaning in life. And I think we're going to have to make some huge changes to our standard of living to deal with the crises that are looming for us, the ecological crisis, some of the economic crisis. So I think I'm actually trying to amplify what Peter said. I think that the more tools we can bring to bear on giving people places where they can reliably and rigorously enhance meaning in life in a way that can be considered, intellectually legitimate, philosophically, perhaps even scientifically legitimate. I think this is a huge cultural imperative for us. However, I am concerned, and you can see it through a lot of what I've been discussing today, we haven't talked enough about how these experiences can also carry with them a tremendous risk of self-deception. And I've been teaching meditative practices and Tai Chi Chuan practices for 2 decades. And people get into these unusual experiences and they can spin off in these horrible, horrible self-deceptive cycles. And psychedelics have the same risk. And so I think if we're going to have an academy, we should both be offering these experiences, as Peter said, to address the meaning crisis. But I think people need to have a rigorous training in the kinds of skills that help them deal with the ways in which we fall into self-deception. I mean, so, you need mindfulness practices for the way we use attention to deceive ourselves. You need active open-mindedness practices for the way we inferentially deceive ourselves. And there's a lot of, and this, we don't have to create this de novo. There is a lot of existing research out there, very good, replicated, robust research on systematic ways in which we can teach people to reduce their capacity for self-deception. And we could do that in conjunction with them going to the academy and eventually taking the psychedelics. So that's what I would propose. Can't hear you, Chris.
Okay. Am I there? I think it's only a matter of time before an academy like this does emerge, because basically it's already happening, but it's not being done, and it's happening at the lay level, it's happening at the societal level, and but it would be good if we could move it into the academy of some form or some formal structure for lots of reasons: standardizing the protocol, clarification of the methodology and the insights that arrive, screening for gullibility, as you're talking about, John, and refining our standards there. The California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco has a program from which a certificate in which they're training the next generation of psychedelic researchers. MAPS is a program like this where clearly it's underway. They are incorporating holotropic breath work as an alternative to administering drugs, which, like you say, Peter, we're not going to be able to do yet, but we will be able to do it hopefully before long. We're going to be able to do it soon. We're going to be able to establish standardized contexts in which people can explore these things. We're going to get better at kind of applying sufficiently critical and skeptical criteria as we sift our experiences. Personally, I think a lot of the skepticism of psychedelic experiences is in part coming from the fact that these experiences contradict the reigning paradigm of our culture. And the reigning paradigm of our culture is reductive materialism or physicalism. These experiences suggest that there is a larger reality at play. But we need to be critical, we need to be careful, we need to take care of our subjects, but this is an extraordinarily powerful opportunity to develop a deeper philosophical discourse, which I think affirms some of the great insights of some of the great spiritual traditions, but also challenges many of the insights in those traditions and goes beyond those traditions and opens up a new territory. I think we're in a new territory here. I think we are still entering into a universe which the telescope has been showing us. We are in a much larger universe, a much older universe, a much more complex universe, a universe where 96% of reality is dark matter or dark energy. It's a much more mysterious place than we thought it was 50 years ago. And I think psychedelics can be a meaningful part of the exploration of that world.
Thank you, Chris, for that fantastic answer. We have a few minutes left for questions. So what do you see as the main obstacles, legal, social, to psychedelics being accepted as generic life or wellness productivity boosters for otherwise healthy people? So outside of the mental health context.
I mean, I just, in England, at least, the main obstacle is people's beliefs, that influence the voting of certain politicians who might change the law. So in a very practical level, if a politician here proposed to declassify psilocybin, for example, from Class A to Class C, or to make it legal, they would probably lose votes, right? So they wouldn't do that, for their own interests. So therefore, the impetus is on a kind of not propaganda, but truthful propaganda, as it were, to make people realize that these substances are not in the main harmful. And when that becomes more prevalent, then the politicians will dare to change the law. At the moment, this is the sort of, in practical terms, this is the sort of main obstacle I find in this country. And that's why David Nutt, for example, and his team in drug science, they're going to work very much now in this coming year on trying to change minds, change hearts and minds. It's like a military operation in a way. Mm-hmm. After that is done, license costs, which are phenomenal for these drugs. I don't even like the word drug, really. These chemicals will go down, hopefully. But of course, we're still in the legacy of all this propaganda from, especially from America, the Reagan administration and so on, which is just, simply, inculcated minds, and thus this is, I think this brainwashing is the main obstacle at the moment. Psychedelics themselves, as I said before, can take you out of that society, and they're sort of like an antidote to this. But of course, people who believe that LSD fries your brain are not likely to take acid, are they? So, we'll have to wait probably a few decades for this to pass.
Yeah, I totally agree with Peter. I think there's so much propaganda bullshit. Psychedelics are of major drug classes, probably the least addictive, and the evidence for that's very clear. And there's even weird cultural stuff, especially in America. Like there was that study that showed you propose a drug that will do certain things for cure a certain disease, and should be taken. And all you do vary in the proposal is that you take the drug and it cures the disease, or you take the drug and it gives you euphoria, and then it cures the disease. And the approval rate for the second version of the drug collapses dramatically. And when you ask people, it seems like, well, people shouldn't have unearned pleasure. There's this weird cultural bias.
I mean, this is Christianity coming through. Ultimately, I would say in America, the Protestant ethic.
I think it's the Puritans, right from the Mayflower going through. Yeah, I agree. Now,
I mean, that's as well.
Pardon me.
That legacy is definitely there. The underlying, Christian legacy is still, I think. Also, of course, sorry, I don't want to butt in, but just quickly on that. Like the Protestant Reformation, this has a legacy as well, because, of course, Christianity in general, they don't want a direct communication with the metaphysical. They want the priests out of power, and thus, if you bypass the priest, of course, this is subconsciously a threat to this the church as the spiritual mother of the nation. So of course, and in America, I mean, in Europe, we've sort of passed that pretty much, but in America, I mean, this surely is an obstacle as well, which is related to the propaganda, no doubt.
It is. And I mean, and you see it even in sort of quintessential Protestant literature like Robert Louis Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where you have the older medieval model of demon possession translated into something that looked like he's taking a drug and it's doing this horrible thing to him. So there's a long established history about that. Things are, I'm in Canada, so it's like if Europe had and the United States had a baby and left it in the snow or something, as John Oliver said. So Canada, right, is in between the two. And so in Toronto, not just Toronto, in Canada, we have legalized marijuana recently. Like it's completely legal now. And it's interesting to see the progression that you had to go through in order to get to the place, right? Because first of all, what you had to do is make the argument for its medical use. And then you had to expand that. And then you had to expand it. And then you had to compare it, once it was expanded, to other socially accepted drugs like alcohol. And then once you did that for a while, and then you could move it out. So I think part of what people need to think about is a strategy of sort of an incremental persuasion rather than say, let's legalize psilocybin. I think for all the propaganda reasons you and I have been talking about, Peter, I think people just say no. But what I saw is a very successful strategy. It's almost like progressive desensitization, right? Of incrementally bringing people to a place where they would, and now everybody goes, oh yeah, of course, legalize marijuana.
Well, that was the wise thing about talking about them. This is called outside the clinic, right? And it's, of course, the first phase is in the clinic. Who can be against helping people? Who can be against therapy? And, it's the deemed evil, if you are. So that's a necessary first step. The danger, of course, is that it stays there. And this is kind of what we're talking about here. That there are, more fundamental issues at stake than simply a new medicine that can be patented.
Well, I agree with what both of you are saying, that it's a fundamental core paradigm of physicalism, which basically leads to these substances being misclassified as hallucinogens, and we all know that hallucinogens are false. And it's the patient demonstration of the beneficial effects of these substances in certain circumstances, which opens the door to reclassify them, and then opens the door further to stepping back and reassessing the validity of this fundamental metaphysical system, that physicalism, that it all reduces down to what's material and that our consciousness reduces down to what's happening in the brain. We have deeply, deeply entrenched beliefs around all of those things. So I think it does have to begin in the clinical setting. It has to begin in demonstrating the therapeutic efficacy. But once that gets more and more solid, then we begin to be able to entertain more radical protocols, which then challenge at deeper levels this metaphysics.
Mm. What I'm waiting for is the hit back. I think so far there hasn't been any real, especially from the right, any sort of criticism of this new movement. But that can easily come soon. And I think
it might not in America because of the microdosing phenomena in Silicon Valley, because the sort of high-end capitalists have already socially sanctioned the use of microdosing in order to enhance performance and productivity. They don't come on it really hard because they're using it, right? They're already using it. What they say is, I don't trip out, because that will affect your, the Protestant work ethic. But they can't really say, oh no, this is just an inherently evil thing to do, and wag their finger at you, because they're using it all over Silicon Valley to enhance performance and creativity. And they're doing it in microdosing. We just did a microdosing study here, and the number of people that are doing it, it's large and it's pervasive.
I mean, I typeset a book by Torsten Passi on the history of microdosing. I mean, it goes back to, there's a lot of literature in Germany from the 1940s, which is unknown. But the conclusion of that is skeptical. That it really has no effect, more placebo effect. So it'll be interesting to see. If it were, I know I haven't looked at the latest stuff, and there's a lot of work on it now. But if it were a placebo effect, I mean, that would have very detrimental effect on what you're saying there.
It could. So, I mean, that's an excellent point, and I should acknowledge it. If it could backlash if it turns out to be placebo. I suspect it's going to turn out to be the measures that were being used earlier were not sort of measures around cognitive flexibility, and now that we have much more refined measures for that, I think the evidence is mounting that it does affect cognitive flexibility, and then cognitive flexibility is predictive of a lot of important changes. So I have the suspicion that the research is going to go that way. However, Peter, I want to acknowledge that what you just said is a real possibility. I was just saying that right now it's holding the right back, I think, from coming down on this stuff really hard.
And also, religious. I mean, that's why it's important really not to exclude the right from what is generally a left-wing discourse at the moment with psychedelia. If you exclude them, then you expect, at least, okay, maybe not in America then, but more Europe, that. And there is an interesting, dark history of psychedelic use with the right wing. I mean, for example, Albert Hoffman, who was sort of center right, I mean, one of his best friend probably, Ernst Jünger, who was a Nazi. I mean, he was he coined the term psychonaut, in 1970, and he's written a book about it. And so there is that history, and this is another interesting fact related to values again, that it seems that they needn't necessarily push a sort of compassionate value scheme. That doesn't, historically at least, this has not been a necessity. And this is what, a very interesting question. I would like to do a study with sort of, looking at Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil in relation to this, and Octavia Paz and Jünger and Hoffman. There's a lot more to be said about. And then the Christian evaluation that at the same time sort of pushes these kind of altruistic values, but at the same time they're pushing down why this has occurred, how it relates to law. I mean, there's so much research still to be done in the social sciences, which people don't, for example, at Exeter, you speak to other academics at Exeter University, and they secretly tell you, oh yeah, for 10 years I took this or that, but they wouldn't say it publicly because they how it is with funding and whatnot. But again, this is part of the push to be honest and open about this psychedelic use now, in order to bring it into acceptability in academic circles. When that happens, there'll be much more research, and there could even be societal progress based on that. And that is the hope anyway.
So we are coming up on the time. We're just a little bit over, but I would like one final question. How do you all feel about the lack of philosophical education in the current paradigm of psychedelic science? And are there any philosophers that you think are the most relevant for psychedelics for people to look into?
I just quickly, I would say Alfred North Whitehead, who done 1947. He is a fantastic philosopher to look into, and the book that I'm editing for Bloomsbury on philosophy of psychedelics will have a little part on Whiteheadian philosophy in relation to psychedelic experience, and that's partly because Whitehead expands our notion of perception, and he's also got a metaphysical system which is quite appealing to psychedelic experiences. So I would say Whitehead. Apart from that, William James, of course, who's one of the pioneers of this research.
Mm-hmm.
So I would pick up on that. I mean, I think James is important precisely because he bridges between philosophy and psychology in a pivotal way. I pick up on Whitehead and that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. I would recommend also looking at the Neoplatonic tradition. I think Arthur Vrost Lewis has made just a very clear historical argument that Neoplatonism is sort of the spiritual grammar of the West. I think there's a tendency to exclude our own spiritual philosophers and think that the only philosophers we should consult are ones from the Eastern tradition. I do think that looking at some of them, the Kyoto school, Nishitani's Religion and Nothingness, I think gives a profound way of bridging between East and West and a vocabulary. I would also recommend somebody that's not read that often anymore, but Bergson is very good, especially with what Peter was talking about, the fundamental transformation in the experience of time. Bergson's notion of durée and the metaphysics of intuition and the mysticism that came out of it, I think is also very, very useful and valuable.
I'll just add to that. Bergson and William James corresponded, of course, and there's a fascinating letter, as you probably know, then from Bergson to James saying, I had this fantastic dream and reported it, and it sounded just like a psychedelic experience. And he said, I really hope, James, you pursue this investigation, this academic investigation into mystical states. He'd written, as well as the book I noted, this essay on mysticism, where he said that nitrous oxide helped him understand Hegel. But anyway, that was Whitehead said in 1930s. Whitehead said philosophy in Europe is dead. This is when Wittgenstein was at Cambridge, Ryle at Oxford. The future of philosophy is Peirce and James, right? Yeah. And then what happened historically, and that was going along that very interesting route of altered states of consciousness. Unfortunately, the wars happened, or the Second World War happened then, and then the Frankfurt School got into America, and philosophy completely changed there. And so we never had this continuation. And at the same time, we had the criminalization of psychedelics in the 60s, so.
But there are also recent philosophers I was going to mention. I think L.A. Paul's work on transformative experience. She literally wrote the book called Transformative Experience. And I have the pleasure of knowing Laurie. I think that's a brilliant and really important book. It gives just some fantastic work, providing you with a conceptual vocabulary, a theoretical grammar that's very relevant to the potential for transformative experience within psychedelics. I think L.A. Paul's work is, and I think it's seminal. It's generating this whole new discourse within academic philosophy around transformative experience. So I highly recommend that book as well.
I'll read that.
I agree with the observations made, and I agree that some of the great Eastern writers have much to teach us in terms that they have a lot of experience exploring these deep dimensions of consciousness. Have always been helpful to me. I think we have a lot to learn philosophically from some of the indigenous cultures, that they have a lot of experience here. So cross-cultural shamanic studies, I think, can be very useful. And I won't be beyond saying, I think over time, I can't see it much, but I think this will stand up over time to philosophical scrutiny. We'll see, maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I'll throw it on the table as a serious attempt by a philosopher of religion to explore the implications of expanded states of consciousness that psychedelics unleash.
Well, then we should plug everybody's book. Peter's doing an anthology on the philosophy of psychedelia, and I have a book coming out with Daniel Craig called The Cognitive Continuum from Insight to Enlightenment. So there, we can plug everybody. We all have books are coming out on this. Peter, what's the title of your book?
Sorry? It was going to be called Philosophy of Psychedelics, but Chris Leatherby's got that name already, unfortunately, just before us. So maybe it would be called Psychedelic Philosophy. I'm not sure yet, but we're working on that. But it will be published by Bloomsbury. who, the Harry Potter publishers in Britain here, and so that will make it sort of mainstream. It'll be an eclectic collection of philosophers with the Whitehead section, as I say, and it's quite. I think it's quite exciting, actually. And of course, I should also, as you did it, Chris, there's this classic, of course, from 2015. That's my old one.
There you go. Yeah.
Have you got yours to hand, John? Probably not.
No, I don't have anything to that.
Next time. Yeah. But there's a lot, there's a lot of literature. I'll just say quickly about philosophy and psychedelic literature. I mean, when I was studying, I was a philosopher of mind, sort of, in the classic way, and then I took magic mushrooms, and I thought, wow, what's going on? Let me read that literature, and I really found relatively little, which I found, quite shocking, really, for such an exceptional experience, and that's what I guess we are all now making up for.
Beautiful. I think that is a perfect note on which to end this. So, John, Peter, Chris, thank you so much. I could listen to this discussion for hours and hours, and I think based on the chat, other people could as well. So, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and it's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah, pleasure meeting you, Chris.
Yeah,
pleasure meeting you, Peter. Really
pleasure.